She walked in with a thrift store parka, a duct-taped rifle case, and silence. No medals, no entourage, just a worn-out M16A4 and a calm that unsettled even the loudest voices in the room. They called her a joke, a lost cowgirl, out of her depth. But what happened next would stop every laugh cold. 10 shots, 1,000 meters, 10 perfect bullseyes, no applause, just stunned silence. Because that woman they mocked? Her name was engraved in brass under the very roof they trained in. This is the story of Margaret Hayes, a forgotten legend, a quiet storm in a world of noise. A story not just about skill, but legacy, respect, and the power of not needing to prove yourself until the moment it matters most. So stay with me, because by the end, you may never look at a quiet face or an old M16 the same way again. Part 1: The Arrival. Margaret Hayes didn't look like anyone's idea of a marksman. She wore a parka that had seen better decades, jeans with a permanent crease at the knee, and boots caked with the kind of dust that doesn't wash out. In one hand, she carried a rifle case patched with duct tape and hope. In the other, a folded slip of paper, her visitor pass. The Pine Ridge Tactical Training Facility wasn't a place for amateurs. It was a place where elite shooters trained under the watchful eye of instructors who had medals on their walls and money in their bloodlines. No one knew what to make of Margaret. She didn't belong. At least, that's what they thought. When she walked past the security gate, a young staffer looked up and blinked like he was seeing a ghost. His eyes landed on the duct-taped case, then on her quiet eyes, then quickly away. He didn't ask for ID. He just clipped the visitor badge to her coat and let her through. She stepped into the lounge, polished walnut walls, leather chairs, glass trophy cases. People in tactical gear lounged with lattes, rifles worth more than cars slung over their shoulders. Conversations paused as Margaret passed, replaced by sideways glances and smirks too polite to be honest. Did she get lost on the way to a garage sale? Someone whispered. Looks like someone brought a museum piece, another said, nodding toward the case in her hand. Someone tossed a token her way, a janitor's token, the kind they handed out as a joke. It landed near her boot. She didn't flinch, she didn't stop, she just kept walking, past the jokes, past the whispers, toward the 1.000 meter range. Up in the tower, an instructor leaned on the railing and took a sip of his coffee. First time someone's brought a mop to a sniper lane. He joked. The laughter followed like fog, low, lingering, and smug, when the announcer's voice crackled through the loudspeaker. It didn't carry a name. Just Entry 9, Open Qualifier, no team affiliation. The profile tablet showed no background, no history, just a mock entry tagged in red. She walked the gravel path alone. The cold air nipped at her coat sleeves. But her steps were steady. She reached the far left station, plain, unmarked, empty. The others had assistants adjusting their optics, feeding them wind data. Margaret had no one, just the rifle case, the mat, and a notebook worn thin with years. As she knelt and began to open her case, more laughter rose behind her. But she didn't speak, didn't react. She opened the latches one by one, revealing a well-maintained but aged M16A4. Its stock was worn, its scope slightly dulled, but the weapon was clean, lovingly kept. She laid it down gently. The range fell quieter than it should have. Because somehow, even in her silence, the air had begun to change. Part 2: The memory behind the rifle. Margaret Hayes laid her M16A4 gently onto the mat, as if setting down a piece of her past. Around her, the other shooters snickered, but her eyes never left the horizon. The wind curled through the pine trees at the far end of the range, carrying with it a memory sharp enough to cut through noise. 3 decades ago, Margaret hadn't been an old woman with a taped rifle case. She was Captain Margaret Hawk Hayes, one of the first female combat instructors at Fort Carson. Back then, her M16A4 was new, crisp, and carried by a woman with a jawline of resolve and a mind trained to outthink chaos. That same weapon had seen sandstorms in Iraq, ice storms in Alaska, and had rested more than once across her lap during long nights when sleep wasn't an option. But all of that was in the past, long enough ago that no one recognized her anymore, long enough that her name had been replaced by younger, Louder voices. She didn't come to reclaim glory. She came for something quieter. A promise. After her military retirement, Margaret taught firearm safety in a local community center, helping veterans reintegrate through skill and purpose. For years, she kept her marksmanship sharp. But she hadn't touched the long-range lane since her husband, Charlie, also a veteran, passed 5 years ago. They used to shoot together. Every Sunday, rain or shine. After he died, Margaret folded up their range mat and placed the M16A4 in storage. Until last week, that's when she got a letter from Pine Ridge. The letter was simple. All former founders are invited to test the updated scoring system. Open qualifiers are now available. Your contributions helped build this range. Come see how far it's come. She nearly threw it away. But there was something about the folded corner, about the way the sender had underlined former founders, that stirred something inside her. So here she was, no entourage, no sponsor jacket, no applause, just a woman with a promise to keep and a weapon built to last. A young shooter nearby, no older than 22, watched as she adjusted the scope on her rifle. She doesn't even have a rangefinder, he whispered to his buddy. Bet she can't hit past 100 yards. Margaret heard it. She didn't need to respond. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out Charlie's notebook. The cover was cracked, the ink faded, but the calculations were still there. Wind charts, drop estimates, bullet behavior at altitude. Charlie used to joke that he trusted Margaret's hand more than any laser rangefinder ever built. She flipped to the back page, traced a familiar line with her finger, and nodded to herself. Then she lay flat on the mat. Up on the balcony, instructors chuckled and muttered jokes about antique shooters and bringing a museum piece to a real fight. But the laughter started to thin. Because her position was perfect. Her posture was fluid. Her breathing, slow, even, practiced. The M16A4 was no modern toy. But it had history, and in the hands of someone who knew every inch of its recoil. It was something more than just a rifle, it was a part of her. The first shot came like a whisper. Then a clean snap echoed. The scoreboard blinked. Bullseye. A long pause followed. Then a second shot. Bullseye again. The laughter died. Phones stopped recording jokes and started recording proof. Somewhere behind her, a voice said quietly, "That's no beginner." A staffer flipped through his clipboard again. Suddenly nervous. "What's her name again?" Someone asked. "No name," he muttered. "Just entry 9. But the instructors upstairs?" One of them stared hard at the mat, at the stance, at the rhythm, his brow furrowed. "Wait a minute," he whispered. They had seen that shooting pattern before, years ago, when the range was still dirt and plywood. Down on the mat, Margaret chambered her next round. Not for pride, not for revenge, but because when you've spent your life earning your place in silence, you don't need to shout to be heard. You just shoot, and let the wind carry the truth. If you're still listening to this story with me, I want to know you're here. Comment 1 below if you're still following Margaret's journey. Your support helps bring these stories to life. And trust me, what happens next is something they'll never forget. Part 3: The Unveiling. By the time Margaret Hayes loaded her third round, the air had shifted. The silence wasn't empty, it was alert. Not a single breath on the upper deck. Not a single laugh from the benches. The same people who had mocked her parka and the duct-taped rifle case were now leaning forward, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Because round 3, bullseye. Round 4, dead center. And the 5th, tight inside the cluster like it belonged there. The scoreboard glowed with the kind of consistency that made professionals nervous. Her grouping was tighter than most could achieve with laser-assisted scopes and $10 rifles. Yet here she was, with a decades-old M16A4 and nothing but a tattered notebook and muscle memory to guide her. In the control booth, a young range tech called over his shoulder, "Sir, you might want to see this." The instructor, one of the veterans of Pine Ridge, looked up from his tablet. "What is it?" "She's 5 for 5, and it's clean, no drift, no spread." The instructor walked slowly to the window, eyes narrowing. Then he stopped cold. "I've seen that form before." On the mat, Margaret remained perfectly still. Only the rhythmic motion of her breathing gave her away. She wasn't watching the reactions. She wasn't performing. She was remembering. Remembering years of wind correction charts Charlie had drawn by hand. Remembering the cold mornings when the rifle felt like ice in her hands. Remembering when she taught soldiers how to shoot with calm and precision. When nobody questioned her credentials, because they saw what she could do. Sixth shot. Bullseye. The tech adjusted the screen angle. Zooming in. That's the same hole. He whispered. Behind Margaret, someone dropped a bottle cap. It hit the floor like a bullet in a chapel. Up in the gallery, the instructor stepped back from the window and grabbed the radio. Patch me into archives, he said. Archives? Yes. Look up the original founders board. Trajectory design team. Focus on marksmanship profiles pre-2000. The voice on the other end hesitated. Copy that. Back on the range, Margaret moved on to shot 7. Then 8. She didn't hesitate. She didn't celebrate. Just a quiet chambering. The whisper of her breath. And then the clean, controlled shot. Over and over again. One of the instructors crossed his arms and muttered. That's not a fluke. That's legacy. Now people weren't just watching her. They were trying to remember her. To place her. Something about the posture. The poise. The familiarity of her control. Shot 9. Same result. And then came the 10th. Margaret blinked once. Exhaled. Squeezed the trigger. The screen took a full second to respond. The cluster was so tight the laser scoring system needed time to register the impact. Then it lit up. 10 perfect shots. 1 perfect score. It wasn't until she opened the bolt, cleared the chamber, and gently laid the M16A4 across the mat that someone in the audience finally exhaled. No one clapped. Not because they didn't want to, but because applause would have felt insufficient. In the booth, the archive tech's voice crackled back over the radio. Sir, you need to come see this. The instructor turned from the glass and jogged to the inner hallway. The tech met him at a terminal already displaying an old photo, a woman in uniform. Standing beside an early schematic of the Pine Ridge scoring system. Beneath it, Captain Margaret Hayes, founding design team, ballistics plus target verification modules. The instructor's voice went quiet. She helped build this place. Back on the range, Margaret packed her things slowly. The badge clipped to her coat, a generic, visitor, pass, fluttered in the breeze as she rose to her feet. At that moment, the brass plaque in the hallway still sat hidden beneath a vinyl advertisement. But within 10 minutes, a retired general who had arrived without fanfare would quietly peel that banner down. And when he did, the truth would be there for all to see. Margaret Hayes, founding contributor, trajectory systems and long-range verification. She had helped design the system used to judge every shot on that range. Her name was etched in metal, forgotten not because she had faded, but because the world had stopped looking. Until now, Margaret walked off the line with her head high, her steps measured and sure. She didn't look around for acknowledgement. She didn't need it. Her legacy was carved into the concrete beneath the 1.000 meter line, and now everyone knew. If you're still following Margaret's journey with me, comment 2 below to let me know you're here. Because what happens next will remind you that some stories don't shout to be heard. They just stand. And when the world finally listens, they never forget. Part 4: When Legacy Meets Challenge. By the time Margaret stepped off the range, the silence behind her wasn't just respect, it was reflection. No one rushed to speak to her. No one dared. The woman who'd been laughed at hours earlier now walked like a living reminder that some things, once buried, only returned stronger. But not everyone handled it gracefully. In the upper lounge, a man named Troy Carver watched the replay of Margaret's final shot on his tablet. A former Marine turned defense contractor and the reigning top shooter at Pine Ridge for 3 years running. Troy had always known where he stood, at the top. Until today, he set his glass down harder than he meant to. That was luck, he muttered. But no one replied. Because even if it had been luck, it happened 10 times in a row. Later that evening, in a closed-door meeting with the range board, Troy proposed something bold. A public challenge. Let her prove it wasn't a fluke. He said, put her on a stage. My turf. Full pressure. 10 weapons. 10 styles. Open range. If she's that good, let's see it. Some hesitated. One board member cleared his throat. She's not a competitor anymore. She's She's part of the foundation. Troy's voice sharpened. Then give her a reason to compete. If she backs down, it confirms everything. Back at her small cottage on the edge of town, Margaret sat at her kitchen table sipping tea, unaware of the storm forming around her. But the next morning, a letter arrived, not an email, not a call, an actual letter, hand-delivered and signed by the Pine Ridge Board. A formal invitation to a legacy match. 10 lanes, 10 platforms, ranges from 200 to 1.200 yards. Rifles provided by the club. All eyes on her. She didn't react right away. Just reread the paper, then folded it once and set it aside. Later that night, she walked into her garage. The lights flickered to life, revealing an old workbench covered in cleaning cloths, tools, and rifle parts. On the far shelf, a photo of her and Charlie rested in a frame no larger than her palm. He'd loved days like this, pressure in the air, sweat on your brow, clarity in your focus. Margaret opened her rifle case, laid the M16A4 on the bench, and began cleaning it piece by piece. It didn't matter if they used new rifles or old ones. The shot was always between the breath and the trigger. 2 days later, news of the legacy match broke on social media. Some called it unfair, others called it history in the making. One clip from her 10-shot perfect score had already passed 500,000 views. Still, Margaret said nothing publicly. She arrived early on match day, again wearing the same parka, the same taped case, only this time, no one laughed. The staff offered a lane before she asked. They gave her a real badge this time, honorary founder. Troy Carver entered moments later with cameras following. Dressed in a sleek tactical jacket, his gear in a wheeled carbon fiber case. He caught Margaret's eye across the prep area. "I was hoping you'd show," he said. Margaret simply nodded once. "I don't walk away from my own blueprint." The match format was simple. Each station featured a different rifle, some military grade, some custom builds, designed to test range, wind reading, recoil control, and adaptability. Troy took an early lead. His years of competition showed. His stances were quick, efficient, textbook. But Margaret's strength wasn't speed, it was precision under pressure. Station after station, she closed the gap. While Troy adjusted scopes, she adjusted her breathing. While he debated wind calls with his spotter, she felt the current on her cheekbones and read it like scripture. By the 8th station, they were tied. At the 9th, Troy fumbled slightly on a misaligned sight and dropped a point. Margaret, in silence, scored 10. By the time they reached the 10th and final station, a custom-built rifle at a brutal 1.200-yard distance, the crowd had shifted. No more cheering, just watching. Margaret chambered the final round. The wind curled in low and fast. She didn't ask for time. She didn't flinch. She fired. A pause. Then the screen blinked. 10. The announcer's voice cracked as he read the final score. Margaret Hayes 98. Troy Carver 96. Troy stepped back, swallowed hard, and offered his hand. "Guess you still know your way around pressure," he said, half smiling. Margaret took his hand with a firm grip. "I don't shoot to prove. I shoot to remember." As she walked off the range, the applause came, not loud, not wild, but full, respectful, earned. And in that moment, every young shooter watching saw something they'd never forget. Grace isn't about being flashy. Legacy isn't about fame. Strength is quiet, still, certain. Part 5. A legacy set in brass. The dust had barely settled from the final shot when Margaret walked off the range with her rifle case in hand, taped, worn, and now revered. Behind her, no one laughed, no one dared. Because that day, they hadn't just witnessed a contest. They had witnessed history. Troy Carver stood still in front of the final target, eyes locked on the cluster of shots. 1 hole, 10 rounds. So tight the system needed thermal imaging to confirm impact. He slowly reached up, pulled off his cap, and held it by his side. That alone told the crowd more than words could. Margaret didn't wait for the ceremony. She stepped past the reporters, declined the interviews, and walked alone to the east wing of Pine Ridge, where the donor plaques lined the wall like a quiet hall of fame. There, in the lower corner where the light never quite hit, was her name, polished now, relit. Margaret Hayes, founding contributor, Systems and Ballistics Division. It had once been covered by a sponsor's banner, forgotten, overlooked, almost erased, but not anymore. A junior range tech stood nearby, quietly dusting the brass. He looked up as she approached, then quickly straightened. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say, what you did out there, no one's ever." She smiled, gentle but firm. "It wasn't about the shots," she said. "It was about memory." That night, Pine Ridge posted the official results online with a caption that simply read, "Mock entry number 9. Verified. Legacy confirmed." The video of her final shot passed 1 million views before sunrise. But Margaret never commented, never posted, never claimed anything more than the truth. Because for her, it was never about proving herself to strangers, it was about keeping a promise. 3 days later, a quiet vote took place among the board of directors. A proposal was made, and passed without a single objection. They would rename the 1.000 yard line. From that day forward, it would be known as the Hayes Line. At the dedication, Margaret didn't speak. She didn't stand on stage. She just sat in the back row, hands folded on her lap, wearing the same parka. But when they unveiled the new plaque, a simple steel engraving set into the ground, it read, "In honor of Margaret Hayes, founding architect of precision, for showing us that strength speaks loudest in silence." Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, a young girl in borrowed gear stepped up to the firing line. Her boots were too big. Her stance was shaky, but her grip was steady. She looked out across the wind-swept distance, then glanced down at the engraved name at her feet. Margaret stood at the far end of the observation deck, unnoticed, watching. And when the girl took her first shot, wide but confident, Margaret nodded once to herself. Because legacies aren't born in fanfare. They're planted in quiet resolve. In the weeks that followed, more students signed up than ever before. Veterans who'd once left the range in silence now returned to coach, to mentor. A new display was installed inside the lounge, just above the fireplace. It held Margaret's original ID badge, her field notes, and a digital replay of her perfect 100 score. No voiceover, no music, just the sound of breath, wind, and 10 quiet, steady shots. One by one, even Troy Carver returned, not as a rival, but as a student. He joined a new training program Margaret helped design for adaptive shooters and wounded veterans. When asked why, he simply replied, "She showed us the line doesn't care who you are, only how you stand when it's your turn." And as for Margaret, she kept coming back, but not to compete, to sit quietly behind the line, helping others with grip, posture, breath, and sometimes, just listening. Because what mattered most wasn't that she had the perfect score. It's that she reminded everyone watching, young, old, seasoned, or new, that dignity doesn't require permission. And true excellence doesn't always wear medals. Sometimes, it wears a parka from the thrift store, carries a taped-up rifle case, and says nothing at all, because the work, the shot, and the moment say everything. Closing reflection. More than just a perfect shot, Margaret Hayes didn't come to prove anyone wrong. She came to remember who she was, and to honor the hands that taught her how to hold steady, breathe deeply, and stand tall in silence. Her story is not just about a perfect score or a 1,000-yard shot. It's about how quiet dignity can shake the loudest room. It's about how experience, patience, and resilience still matter in a world obsessed with speed and surface. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that our worth isn't determined by our appearance, our age, or the tools we carry. It's revealed in how we carry ourselves when no one believes we belong. For those of us who've lived long enough to have been overlooked, underestimated, or simply forgotten, Margaret's story is a quiet affirmation. You are never too old to make an impact. You are never too late to be remembered. And the legacy you leave may not come from applause, but from the people whose lives you touched by simply showing up, staying kind, and standing firm. So if her story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of your own strength, or of someone who once stood tall when the world tried to shrink them, leave a comment below, share your thoughts, or just type, "Still standing," to let us know you're with us. And if you'd like more stories that honor resilience, quiet strength, and timeless courage, don't forget to like, subscribe, And hit the bell icon so you never miss a moment that matters. Because here on BN Story, we believe the best stories aren't always loud. They're the ones that echo longest in the heart.